Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? And by the way, where is my bucket? Thus begins one of the best known stories in the New Testament, where Jesus is really breaking with convention. First, we need to know a little bit about the Samaritans and what was so repellent to a workaday, run-of-the-mill Jew. This selection from John's Gospel is one of 5 stories we have heard and will hear this Lent. The first Sunday, we heard of Jesus' temptation from the devil while he spent 40 days in the wilderness. And last week, the second Sunday, we heard about Nicodemus, a highly regarded spiritual leader who comes and needs to talk to Jesus by night. Today, it's the woman at the well who we will return to in a minute. Next week, we'll hear about Jesus healing the blind man. And the last week, we'll hear about him bringing his cousin Lazarus back to life. 5 different stories. 5 times, Jesus reveals a little more about who he is and what he is about. These are just some of the signs that Rick talked about last week. Before we return to, today's gospel, a few words about the Samaritans. The Samaritans had built a temple for themselves on Mount Gerizim, which the Samaritans insisted was designated by Moses as the place where the nation should go and worship. The idolatrous religion of the Samaritans became perpetuated, for they refused to acknowledge Jerusalem. Samaria had become a place of refuge for all the outlaws of Judea. They had willingly received Jewish criminals and refugees from justice. The violators of Jewish laws and those who had been excommunicated found safety for themselves in Samaria, greatly increasing the hatred which existed between the 2 nations. The Samaritans believed only in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, and rejected the writings of the prophets and all the other Jewish traditions. From these causes arose an irreconcilable difference between them. So the Jews regarded Samaritans as the worst of the human race and had no dealings with them. In discovering all this information, I found that the Gospels of both Luke and John have only good information about the Samaritans, the so-called renegades. Luke tells the story of 2 instances where Samaritans act in a highly positive manner. One you may recall is the healing of 10 lepers. Only one returns to thank Jesus. And Luke makes a point to state that he was a Samaritan. The story of the Good Samaritan is not someone who just stops and takes care, but also provides aftercare and payment of all of his bills. In today's gospel, we see yet another Samaritan, the woman living in Sychar. Jesus does a simple thing. After sending his disciples for lunch, he says, "Give me a drink." This is remarkable on several levels. First, the man did not just strike up a conversation with a woman in that place and time. And women are not to talk to one another in public. It is not considered proper. Second, he is also someone rejected by her own people with a stained reputation. Noon is the hottest time of the day. Morning and evening are times when they're doing the hard work of drawing water from a well and taking it home. This is work that women do in company with one another. It's a chance to chat for some social contact. But this woman specifically chooses a time to go when she will be alone. She sees herself as a misfit. She avoids others in order not to be hurt, again by their words, their attitudes, and hard works. Third, here is a Jew speaking to a Samaritan, a societal oops. Sometimes we think that Jesus comes to explain himself, yet he never explains himself. He speaks, he talks, and you say yes, or you walk away, or you go, interesting. But he never tries to rationalize. He never tries to make the message sound sweeter so that more people would follow him. He speaks the truth, but always speaks the truth in love. He goes on to tell her later on that you've had 5 husbands. He asked her to go get her husband. And she says, I don't have one. And he said, well, yeah, that's true, but you've had 5 before. And he then proceeds to go on. She immediately avoids responding to that and returns the conversation to saying, well, give me some of your living water so I don't have to trudge here every day, every week, and bring my water home. And at the end, she confesses her faith in the Messiah, who she knows is to come. And Jesus responds and says that he is the Messiah. The woman didn't get it. She said, I know the Messiah comes, he who is called Christ. When he has come, he will declare all things. Jesus then says, I am he. I am the one who speaks to you. The woman left her jar and ran into town. Come see a man who told me everything that I did. Can this be the Christ? Many theologians have described this woman as the first evangelist, one whose witness changes not only for herself, but those who are around her. At this point, there's a break in the story as Jesus confers with his disciples. And in the meantime, the woman goes back to the village, leaving her bucket that is essential to her well-being, and tells everyone she meets what's happened. As a result, John says, from that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him, and because of the word of the woman, they not only took her at her word, but they also allowed her back to the well. Jesus thus reveals his identity, not to his disciples, not to his people, not to the religious leaders, but this person who was a marginal 3 times over. She's a Samaritan. She's a woman, an exile among her own kin. We do not even know her name. And yet Jesus entrusts her with his deepest secret, the truth of who he is. Preparing for today, I was struck by the words at the end of the Decalogue that we say during Lent. Jesus tells of the 2 great commandments. You shall love your Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. This is the greatest commandment. Love God above all else. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I really can't find any trouble with the first. I'll find that out when I'm no longer here and face God face to face. But the second one, I think about a lot. That is a tough one. It is subject by everyone I meet. Here in this small Syrian village, Jesus is living out the second great challenge to this woman who he has just met. Jesus spends a lot of time with people most Christians don't want in their church. When you revisit the story of Nicodemus and in the next week, him reacting to Bartimaeus and Lazarus in much the same way, all of these marginalized people are neighbors. Now, lest this be taken as a nice story that happened a little over 2,000 years ago, it was very interesting. Last Friday night, we had a meeting in Hyde Park with the citizens who were up in arms over the final step that we've taken with the shelter in Lamoille Community House. The state has finally given in to our request, have donated $3.7 million, I think, to Lamoille Housing Partners, who are going to take the old Forest View rest home and convert it. And the neighbors, I think, having a sense a lot to do with the political environment that people just don't trust judgment for any political system or immediately becomes polarized. had questions, and they were good questions. They weren't really out of date. There was a question about the presence of sex offenders. What's going to happen to my property values? What's going to happen with increased traffic? And as a counterbalance, uh, we had a lot of the other social service people who were there talking about how they complimented our work. And it all stopped when two people spoke, one a current resident at the shelter, and another one, a former resident who was found housing. And they talked about the profound change that it made to them. So there's really not much difference between what happens on a dusty village in Sychar on a hot noonday and what happens in Hyde Park a couple thousand years ago. What boundaries will you breach today? What unexpected conversation will you invite with any of your new neighbors? I want to close with a poem I found in a commentary on this passage. Father Dennis Hanley was a Maryknoll missionary for 55 years. And in his commentary on the woman at the well, he closes with the following poem. My brothers and sisters, there is a thirst in every human heart. Each of us is like that lonely Samaritan woman. We are thirsting for something that will satisfy all our longings. But often we search in all the wrong places. We draw water from many wells, the water of praise to quench our thirst for self-esteem, the water of success to quench our thirst for importance, the water of pleasure to quench our thirst for joy. And yet we still remain thirsty. For only God can give us what we are looking for. God alone can cause a spring to well up inside us, and the water from this spring will sustain us in our journey to the promised land and everlasting life. Amen.